Hey everyone, welcome back to another Brain Dead Reviews video. I'm going to be talking about 10 death metal albums that I didn't get to mention in the previous video because there was so many. The ones that made it into the top 10 will not be mentioned here just because there'd be no point. We'd only get 4 more albums today because 6 of them were in yesterday's video. So no repeats from the last video. And just bear with me a little bit. There will be a couple of setup changes and things like that. I'm trying different things, so just bear with me until I get it perfected, or as close to perfect as I'll ever get it. We're going to start by mentioning 2 bands who released big albums. They're big bands, but they just were kind of disappointing. That was Morbid Angel with Kingdom's Disdain. And I hate to call it disappointing because it's not really disappointing, especially after Illud Divinum Insanus was the last thing we had got from these guys prior to this. So it was refreshing to hear them kind of redeem themselves, but it just kind of falls short. The album for most of the first half is not that great. Picks up in the second half, but better luck next time, Morbid Angel. And then Obituary with their self-titled. This is mostly because I'm just not that big of a fan of Obituary. I don't think that they're that great. Nothing really that's their fault, but you won't hear them mentioned here, except for that. These are not in any kind of order. They're just 10 more. We'll start with the Swedish boys, Entrails, with their new one, World Inferno. These guys pretty much picked up where Entombed left off. They're carrying the torch on releasing great Swedish death metal, and they're never going to make album of the year. They kind of play it safe with their song structures, and the way they do things kind of stays consistent from album to album. It's working for them. Like I said, they're not going to make any top of the year lists, but you know what you're getting, and it's always going to be good. So good job, Entrails. In Full Darkness is our next album with their album Adversary Omnipotent. These guys, very interesting with them. They went on a decent little hiatus after their last album, and it's been a while since we heard from them. And then we get this album, and it's pretty great. If you like bands like Flesh God Apocalypse or bands such as that, there's a lot of melodeath, there's a little bit of black metal in there. It's very progressive stuff. It's good. Highly recommend picking it up. Unfortunately, shortly before or after it was released, I believe it was their bassist who passed away, so really sucks he didn't get to see everybody enjoy what he was had a hand in creating. Next album, Mutilated and Assimilated by Broken Hope. Admittedly, I'm not overly familiar with these guys other than this album right here, so all I can really comment on is this is just straight up fun death metal. Feels a lot like some of the old, I would say, early 90s death metal that was coming out around then. Just good old classic death metal. Not a lot of comments really needed on this one. Go listen to it. Next album by the Death Grind boys in Hemorrhage, We Are the Gore. This album is a lot of fun. It just, you know what you're getting into with Hemorrhage. If you've never heard Hemorrhage, you know what you're getting into when you look at this cover. Just over the top, stupidly gory lyrics about surgery, and if you like old Carcass stuff, obviously these guys were big fans of Carcass because it sounds a lot like the Symphonies of Sickness era of Carcass, and they do it really well. They kind of stick to their same style as well, like they did from the last couple of albums, but it's working for them. They're pulling it off great every time, and you will be chanting Gore Gourmet for days after you hear that song. So, good job, Hemorrhage. Next album, a band who needs no introduction, Cannibal Corpse with Red Before Black, the most popular death metal band of all time. Just does it again. I think it's a little better than the last one, A Skeletal Domain. Maybe just barely inching by it. But you know what? Cannibal Corpse, they always put out a great death metal album that is a lot of fun, has some ridiculous song titles sometimes, like Heads Shoveled Off. That's one of my favorite Cannibal Corpse titles I've heard in quite a while. So, had a lot of fun with this one. I liked that they went ahead and did another decent length album. It's about 45 minutes in length. So plenty of material there, and a couple of tracks that are going to be probably some concert staples for the next couple of years to come, like Red Before Black, Only One Will Die. Just a couple of the ones that, you know, really stood out from the album, the singles. So thanks Cannibal Corpse for another bloody album, and look forward to the next one. Next album on our list, Gut Slit with Amphitheater. I was introduced to these guys a couple of weeks back. This is some brutal stuff. What I really liked that they did on this is a lot of the slam bands, like Cranium, will use samples and just some really stupidly over the top like movie quotes or just some like spooky setup stuff like that to open this or close the tracks. They did that a couple of times on this album, and it was kind of refreshing to hear it done, but not with some obnoxiously long, like 30-second clips like some bands will do. They just had a little intro and then went into the song, and they didn't do it on every single track, so it didn't feel special anymore, you know. I think Adult does it on a couple of tracks. So this is some just really good brutal death metal, and if you like Suffocation or any of the other classic brutal death bands like that, Cryptopsy, have at it. Gut Slit, good job. Next album, Exhumed with Death Revenge. Now these guys are kind of known like Hemorrhage to be legends in the death grind, gore grind subgenre. However, unlike Hemorrhage, Exhumed changed it up a little bit on this album. For better or worse, it's a little bit for worse, I'm not gonna lie. I liked the Hemorrhage album more, but I applaud Exhumed for taking some risk. They threw in a little bit of melodic death metal guitar in this one, and that made it interesting. It's a little hard to get used to, but I like that they took a risk, especially after having such a long career and not taking a ton of risks along the way. They did here. They also, there's like a 7-minute instrumental track on this. If you're into instrumentals, it's good. I kind of found it to be taking away from the album a little bit. I don't think it helped it, but you know, again, experimenting, trying new things this late into their career. I applaud them for trying, but I think it fell short a little bit. But you know what? Still an overall, all-around quality release from these guys. So, thanks Exhumed for another great album. The next album on this list is definitely, this is my favorite of all of them. This would have been number 11 on my top albums of the year. The Faceless with In Becoming a Ghost. Wow. They really, really changed things up on this one. Used to be just straight up deathcore back in the beginning of this band's career, because they came out around the time as bands like Whitechapel, Suicide Silence, and took on, jumped on the whole deathcore bandwagon that a lot of those bands were on at the time. and it worked okay for them. You know, they gained some popularity from it. Not everyone was on board fully though. You know, not everyone fully embraced deathcore like that. And the Faceless have done a good job of evolving from album to album. And we've gotten now to this, I think this is the Faceless 5th album, maybe 4th, it might be the 5th. I think it's the 5th. And they've gotten to the point now where they're doing all kinds of crazy stuff on here. There's a little bit of flute on one song, totally unexpected. They covered, what was it? Shake the Disease by Depeche Mode on this album. That's out of left field. Who saw that coming? As far as the style they play in, it's I would say progressive death metal at this point, but it's also very technical. They've kind of really abandoned their deathcore sound altogether, which is interesting. Like I talked about in the last video, Through the Eyes of the Dead, they've mostly abandoned the deathcore, but they still use it to spice things up. Not the Faceless. It's pretty much gone from the beginning, and I think it's for the better, because this is a damn good album, and I think I've said all there is to be said about it, at least that I'm going to say about it. Next on our list, Inanimate Existence with Underneath a Melting Sky. I'm still pretty new on this one, but after listening to it again today, oh, we've got Hour of Penance. My bad. We'll talk about that one first. Hour of Penance with Cast the First Stone. Kind of funny. These guys have kind of stayed with their technical, brutal death metal sound that they've had over the years. But they just tweak it a little bit on each album, and I think they kind of strayed away from their roots for a little bit, and then back to it with this one, and it really, I think, paid off for them. This album was very early on in the year, so I don't think that did them any favors for making end of the year lists, but they really deserve some credit for what they did here. Another band who's a little bit like Flesh God Apocalypse, so if you like them, I would definitely check out Hour of Penance if you have not. Now we should have Inanimate Existence if I did this right. Well, we don't have a picture for that, but just like I was saying, they're really, really good progressive and technical death metal, and I can't really use those terms in a way that would help you fully appreciate just by how much they are progressive and they are technical. They're on levels above what you usually think of whenever you hear those terms. They do a lot of experimenting with different sounds and stuff on the album, and it's a fun listen. I highly recommend it. I'm still new to it myself, but bravo to Inanimate Existence and the rest of the bands who made this list. They all deserve to be on somebody's end of the year list, so props to them, and maybe they'll make the next list, who knows. So I will see you guys in the next video. Thanks.